So the voice of privilege. This is the image is meant to be of a man who typically is considered probably the most privileged kind of person that you have in society of the day. White, middle-class man, at the top of his game with lots of money and has lots of influence. That's why we've got the television crew there. And we get a lot of those people who are in the higher parts of society. We've obviously got people like Elon Musk, and as we spoke about earlier, Donald Trump and various other people. Back in the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages as sometimes it's called, Thomas More was one of those kinds of people. He definitely was a voice of the privileged, and because he was very privileged, he had a voice. He was a lawyer and a statesman in the King Henry VIII's court. So if you know anything about King Henry VIII, he was a Catholic, but he left the Catholic faith because he wanted to divorce his wife and started a new church, but it was essentially just a carbon copy of the Catholic Church. And it was known as the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. But this man, he was an ardent defender of the Catholic faith, very ardent, because he was responsible for the persecution and death of the first Protestant reformers in England. So there had been Protestant reformers who had protested against the Roman Catholic Church and the abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, who lost their life in Europe, but not as yet in England. And he was responsible for the very first ones in England. He actually wrote a book called Utopia. So this is a copy of Utopia, and it's about a new world order, a perfect world, a world where everything is in harmony, which is kind of what we were talking about in our first session today. Everything and everyone is subjected to a universal common good. And as a consequence, there's no private property. Family units are subject to the state. There's universal labour and basic income. And religious tolerance is allowed as long as you agree with the utopian way. So if you don't agree with the utopian way, then you aren't tolerated. So that was what he promulgated through this book. It is actually really Catholic theology, but it has become a very famous book and it's been read throughout all of the centuries. And even today, this is a third edition of that particular book. And if you can see, this particular edition was up for sale now, whether or not it sold for that much, for $81,000 because it's so highly prized. He, unfortunately for him, didn't live in his version of Utopia, and consequently he was beheaded by King Henry VIII, because when King Henry VIII formed the Anglican or Church of England Church, King Henry said, "I am now the head of this church." And because Thomas More was a very faithful Catholic, he didn't want to acknowledge King Henry VIII as being the head of the church. He only wanted the Pope to be the head of the church. He didn't recognize it. And so he was tried for treason against the king and beheaded in 1535. But because he was seen as a martyr of the Roman Catholic faith, Pope Leo XIII, and now that's a very interesting pope actually, because we now currently have in this world a new pope who is Pope Leo XIV. And Pope Leo XIV has named himself Leo because he is copying or wants to copy Pope Leo XIII. But he was the one who sainted, if you can be a person to saint another. I believe only God does the sainting around here. But he sainted Thomas More, or beatified, or canonized is the other term, I believe, Thomas More. And it was because of his steadfast commitment and fidelity to Catholic doctrine and the Roman Catholic Church. Then later on, Pope John Paul II declared St. Thomas More the heavenly patron of statesmen and politicians. Why is that? Because in his book, he not only was he a statesman, but in his book, he wrote about really how the politicians and the statesmen would work together to form utopia. Now, someone wrote this about utopia. And basically they were saying, so there's one word, utopia, and on the other side is dystopia. So utopia is where everyone apparently is happy and at peace, and dystopia is where everyone's unhappy and afraid. But this is what this person wrote. There are socialists and capitalists, monarchical, democratic, anarchist, ecological, feminist, patriarchal, egalitarian, hierarchical, racist, left-wing, right-wing, reformist, free love, nuclear family, extended family, gay, lesbian, and many more utopias. So he's actually saying we all have our idea of what the perfect world is going to be. It might be because we're left-wing. The other ones might be because they're right-wing, and others because they're racist, and others because they're not racist. You have all kinds of pictures of what utopia is. So utopianism, some argue, is essential for the improvement of the human condition. But if used wrongly, it becomes dangerous. Utopia has an inherent contradictory nature here. And the reason is what we were talking about earlier, we cannot actually create the perfect world ourselves. We all are going to have our own version of what is utopia, or what is truth. And consequently, what I think is utopia would probably be your dystopia. And that's what poor Thomas More experienced. His utopia was a different one from King Henry VIII, so he lost his head. And it's interesting because I spoke about the UN earlier as well, but the UN has a very interesting approach to actually achieving what they consider utopia. This is actually taken from their website. Peaceful coexistence is not utopia but reality, says UN official fostering intercultural dialogue. Now, the word utopia actually means no place, because there is no place on this earth that is perfect. So what they're actually saying is we can achieve utopia, but it actually isn't no place, it is here. And we do it through our political and peace-building affairs. Remember me saying how we know the world is wrapping up because we're all heading towards this unified picture. Well, what the UN and the various entities are trying to achieve is Thomas More's utopia. And so that's why when you have a peacekeeping arm of the UN, you send people in to keep the peace with machine guns like that. Do you see why someone's utopia can be another person's dystopia? So if you don't comply, you have an encounter that may be quite deadly. This world is really crying out for help. Not just individuals, but everyone is crying out. We all, I don't know whether you've spoken to people lately, and there's been this sense that we're in a waiting period. You just kind of feel like something else is coming. Like we had the whole pandemic thing, and that just like rocked our world. We were completely taken by surprise. But now we're starting to go, there's something else brewing. When is it coming, and what is it? Some people think that if only they had a voice of privilege like Thomas More, they could actually make this world a better place. So if only I had more influence or more wealth or a better career, I could make my life, other people's lives, make things ever so better. Well, there was someone who thought that they could make the world a better place too. He was part of the Egyptian royal family, which was the world's superpower at the time. He was next in line to be Pharaoh. He would have been the leader of the world. He was good looking. He had the best education in the world's best schools, and he had access to the best health service. Do you know who I'm talking about? Moses, yes. We all know him as being the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt. But why didn't he stay in Egypt and use his privileged position to free his people? I mean, after all, he literally could have been the next Pharaoh. He had the best education. He would have had the army at his disposal. Why didn't he stay? In Acts 7:22-23, it says, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. Does that sound like someone that couldn't have done much? It sounds like someone that could have done a lot. Why didn't he stay there? He could have helped his people in a different way than the way that they wouldn't have had to go wandering through a wilderness like they did. They could have maybe just taken over Egypt. When he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. He knew he was an Israelite. It wasn't like he didn't know. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended them and avenged them that was oppressed and smote the Egyptians. So he saw an Israelite being hit by one of the Egyptian taskmasters, and he stepped in. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. So he knew that he was an Israelite. He knew that he was actually somehow going to be delivering his people from oppression. So why didn't he stay? The next day he came to find two Israelites fighting, and he tried to intervene, but they asked him who made him their ruler. And so in Acts 7:29 it says, then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian. Sorry, I think that I've put a wrong word in there. It should be Midian, where he begat two sons. Yes, even though he had a voice of privilege, he didn't stay because he went around it the wrong way, and God had another plan. So he did try to use his voice of privilege. He tried to use his education, his position, his influence, his whatever else, but he wasn't able to bring utopia to his people. So for the next 40 years, he's wandering around a wilderness, as we spoke about earlier, and he suddenly comes across a burning bush. And out of that burning bush is a voice, and the voice calls out to him, and he comes closer, and then he takes off his shoes, and God asks him to go back to Egypt to lead his people out. What a request after he'd already tried. He tried under the most favorable circumstances, the most educated, highest position of influence, young. And now he says this, "O my Lord, I'm not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of slow tongue." Don't you remember it just said before that he was learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds? Now he's saying, I can't say anything. I'm not that good. Do you know what? It actually takes God requires for us to get to the point where we don't have the privileges of this world for him to be able to use us. He had to leave all of those privileges behind, where he didn't really have a voice, because whose voice was it going to be? It was going to be God's voice. And the Lord said unto him, "Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the dumb or deaf, or the seeing or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth and teach thee what thou shalt say." You see, beforehand, he would have actually been doing it all in his own strength because he had a lot of it, but now he had none. And so Moses goes back and he stands before the ruler of the then known world. It was a new Pharaoh, a Pharaoh that he hadn't actually necessarily grown up with, and he's standing before him to reveal the power and glory of God. When he had 40 years of looking after sheep. Does the irony of that actually dawn on you? He'd been looking after people as a mighty commander of the Egyptian army, and now he'd been looking after sheep. And he'd probably forgotten much of what the Egyptian language was like because he hadn't been using it, and potentially even some of the Hebrew language because he'd been amongst the Midianites, not the Hebrews. And God is sending him back when he was weak and underprivileged, if you will. This is what it says about Moses. By faith, Moses, when he had come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasure in Egypt. For he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for endured as seeing him who is invisible. You see, in that moment when he had actually come to his senses and realized, I don't have what it takes to lead Israel out of Egypt, he suddenly actually woke up and went, I can leave this all behind and lean on God. And it took 40 years for him to get to the point where he'd fully gotten to the point where he could lean on God entirely and he would go back. And it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses face to face as a man speaks unto his friend. This is actually one of my most favorite verses in the Bible. It actually took him to lose all of his privilege before he could actually be a friend of God. Would you like to talk to God face to face? To me, that's my highest aspiration. It says of this as well, and there arose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was actually considered a great prophet, not because of his training in Egypt, not because of his position in Egypt, not because of the wealth that he had in Egypt, but because he was faithful to God and he trusted him. And we know from Scripture that Moses is actually now in heaven. He was resurrected. He died, but he didn't actually rot away on the ground. He got resurrected and he was on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. And he's there looking down on us, talking about him today. Isn't that amazing? But there was another privileged person which God used, but not because of their privilege. It's this person, Saul, who later became Paul. It says of Saul, as for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women and committed them to prison. He says, though I might also have confidence in the flesh, if any other man think that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. He was the most credentialed person in this world. He was trained, but he actually became credentialed in God's work through weakness. If you feel weak, if you feel unable, if you feel uncredentialed, if you don't feel privileged, if what of all of those things, God doesn't need those things. He doesn't need wealth. He doesn't need position. He doesn't need influence. He doesn't need a voice. He just needs you to be able and willing. When I mean able, I mean willing to be made able. You can see Paul here, when he met Jesus, he actually lost his sight. And Dieter actually said to us the other day, and I said, I haven't thought of it like that before. And he said, it took him to lose his sight before he could finally see. And sometimes that's the case when it takes for us to lose all of our privileges of this world before we will reach out to God and the privileges that he has to offer. We don't know what happened to Paul, but we know that somehow he ended up, maybe he continued to have some sort of weakness with his sight, we don't know. But he was asking the Lord to remove whatever this thing was that he had. It says, unless I should be exalted above measure, so once again start to think that I'm somehow special, through the abundance of revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice or 3 times that it might depart from me. So somehow he wanted to have some sort of restoration to what he'd had before he met Christ. But how does Christ respond? My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, and persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We may not have a voice of privilege in this world, in the sense of what this world looks for. We might not be in a position of authority. Our career might not be amazing, or our jobs might not be amazing. We may not have a lot of wealth, but God has a purpose for each and every single one of us. Not to just sit in a pew, not just to come into church, but to be used in his kingdom. You know, Paul, despite the fact that he had something, and the consensus is it was a sight issue, he actually went on to write 14 books of the Bible. Now, volume of words, it probably doesn't amount to the same as what Moses wrote, but he wrote more books than Moses. He took the gospel to the then known world through his work with the Gentiles. We are here today. Is anyone here a Jew? Hebrew? We are here today because of Paul. And you know what? He testified also, like Moses, before the then known ruler of the world, of the then known world. Now, the most underprivileged person, I'm sure you'll recognize it straight away. He was born in questionable circumstances. His mum was not married. He came from the wrong neighborhood, Nazareth. He'd not been to school. He didn't receive the education of the wealthy and the privileged. He had no home. He was likened to the devil. He was deemed worthy of death by the qualified leaders, those who actually did have the privilege. And he had a life of grief and sorrow. But he saved the world. He was more underprivileged than Moses, more underprivileged than Paul, but he saved the world. What does it take to be used in God's kingdom? It's interesting, each of these three people, Moses, Paul, and Jesus Christ, were used by God despite no privilege. This one led God's people from slavery to freedom. This one took the gospel to the world, and he saved the world. But all believed that the greatest privilege was listening to and following the voice of God. What is the voice of privilege? It's not those who are wealthy in this world's stuff. It's not those who have a position in this world. It's not those who have careers that are going somewhere. No, it's those who've listened to the voice of God. In fact, if you look at the story of the Bible, the privileged are the ones that are lost. Genesis 6 verse 4 says, talking about those who actually reject God in the time of Noah, they were called mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. In Revelation, talking about those that are lost at the end of time, it says, and the light of the candle shall no more shine at all in thee, so they won't hear the voice of the bridegroom, which is Jesus, or of the bride, which is his church. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived. The great men, those of privilege, are the ones who typically are lost. Why? Because they trust in those positions, those money, those careers, those whatever, instead of trusting in God. As I said, those who actually have the real privilege are those who listen to God. In Genesis 4:26, to contrast with the great and mighty men, it says that those who were in Seth's line, so those who were saved, called upon the name of the Lord. That was their sole qualification. In Revelation 19:16, it says, this is talking about Jesus, and he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So what was the name that they were calling upon? The King of Kings and Lord of Lords. You know, Jesus set aside all the privileges of heaven to come and rescue us. I spoke about earlier that Jesus is about to return. But are we ready? Are we ready to lay down everything at his feet? Are we ready to put aside our careers, our comforts, whatever it may be, to serve the Lord and take his message to the world? I want to go home to heaven. I'm sorry, this is an AI generated image. It's not very good. I wish I could have a picture of heaven, a true picture, because I think it would be far more beautiful than this. But the reality is that we're going to have all of us together in heaven. And I don't want any of this world anymore. When we had, over the last 5 years, I was talking to a couple of ladies up here earlier, and we were talking about how we lost our jobs. And we had, I think for those of you who were here last night, the kids showed a picture of our very aerated kitchen last night. And it was a challenge. You know, I had nails go through my feet, and Abigail had her leg sliced open by a tile that broke away from the wall, and we had injury after injury, and we had all kinds of critters crawling into the house and doing their things. We had nowhere to cook. It was a very difficult time. And one day I had this, I was telling Dita this during the week, I had this thing where we had wooden floors, so I ended up sanding them. I bought this big barrel sander and I was sanding back and forth, spent hours and hours, days and days sanding this floor so that it was actually somewhat nice. And I thought, I'm going to do that first before I paint the walls, because it creates so much dust that if I paint the walls first, the dust's going to settle on the nice walls and that's just not going to work. So I'll paint the walls next. So I finished sanding, and then, you know, in a rush, I'm painting the ceiling, painting the walls, doing all of that sort of thing, and I didn't move the drop sheet around enough. And unfortunately, there was paint splattered across this floor all over the place by the time I was done. And I thought, oh, that's okay. I'll just get some terps or eucalyptus oil or something and I'll rub it out. I don't know about you, but if you've experienced this, you've dropped paint onto raw timber. Does anyone know what happens? It soaks it up. It doesn't sit on the surface. It like goes right into the timber. And I tried my first and I'm like, oh no, this doesn't just clean up. What am I going to do? I can't sand the floor all over again because I've just painted. I don't want the dust to go everywhere. I'll have to hand sand. 60, what was it? 66 square meters. I don't know whether conceptually you can think about how big that is, but 66 square meters of paint literally splattered. Every single board has paint, like little drops, but still everything. And I'm going, okay, I'm going to have to hand sand. Right. So I started hand sanding. I got down on my knees and my hands, and for days and days and days I was sanding. And then when I got to the worst possible section, I'd sanded everything else, got to the worst possible section, and I'm sanding, and the paint is just not wanting to come out. It's gone so deep. And I'm like, Lord, I hate this. I hate this life. I can't stand it. I'd had a job. I had my own clinic. I had to leave that because I chose not to get a vaccine. I had a beautiful home. I had a ministry. Our kids used to go to a really good school. We had a church plant that we were doing. We had a health ministry we were doing. We had lots of friends. And we had to leave it all behind because we couldn't afford to live where we were living after both of us losing our jobs. And I'm kneeling down on the floor, and I wasn't saying anything out loud because probably that would have actually come out worse, but I was yelling in my mind at God, saying, God, I've got this qualification, I've got that qualification, I've done this for you, Lord, I've done that for you, Lord, I've done this, and this is what I'm left with, sanding floors on my hands and knees. Lord, isn't there something better? And the Lord said to me, I'm just going to, sorry, my Bible. You know where I'm looking. And the Lord just quietly spoke to me, very gently, and said that you may know me and the fellowship of my suffering. What? To sand floors is to know you, Lord? You know, Paul suffered the loss of all things. And that's what he talks about in this same passage where I've got things coming up all over the place now. I've put my Bible on here. Sorry. Okay. It's from Philippians chapter 3, if anyone has their Bible. Philippians chapter 3, and we'll start at verse 7. But what things were gain to me, those I counted loss for Christ. All the privileges in this world, we need to count for loss. I think I'm doing something that's making noise. Might just hold on to that. Yea, doubtless I count all things lost, but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I suffered the loss of all things, and do count them but dung, that I may win Christ, and be found in him, not having mine own righteousness which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith, that I may know him, and the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformable unto his death, if by any means I might attain unto the resurrection of the dead. The greatest voice, a privilege we can have in this world, is in Jesus alone. You don't need money. You don't need a career. You don't need a position of influence. You just need Christ. Everything else can be counted as dung.